Good evening and welcome to Hello It's Us. Hello It's Us is dedicated to educating the general public, the viewers, about issues that are important to people with disabilities. And as we do so, we really believe that you will determine that these issues are important to the general public. Hello It's Us is brought to you through a collaboration between the University of Iowa Center for Disabilities and Development, Uptown Bill's Coffee Shop, and our good friends here at Public Access Television. My name is Mike Honig, and I work as a program coordinator at the Center for Disabilities and Development. Keith?
I'm Keith Rock, the co-anchor of the show. I'm retired from working for Independent Living Center in Iowa City, and I'm currently writing a book.
Well, great. That sounds like topic for our show. Well, we're really excited this evening. This is Martin Luther King Diversity Week here on campus, and I happened to see an email about a month ago, maybe a little less, about a visit from Maria Flores, who is a program manager with the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, based in Milwaukee. And I contacted her to see if she might be interested in coming on and talking with us about what the EEOC does, and she jumped at the chance. So we've gotten to know each other quite well through email over the past couple weeks and by phone, and so now she's here in person. Maria, welcome to the show.
Welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to join the program.
Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
Well, tell us a little bit about what brings you into Iowa City.
Well, my primary responsibility at the EEOC is education and outreach. And when there's an opportunity to spread the word about EEOC, then we're going to make good use of those opportunities. So often I'll be invited to do a major event, and then I want to fill in my calendar. And so I reach out to advocacy groups, employer groups, in this case, college or university, anything that we could find different avenues to reach the public.
Great. And you are doing a major event tomorrow? Friday?
That's correct. I'm going to be conducting a keynote presentation about vulnerable workers at the University of Iowa as part of their Human Rights Week.
Terrific.
Okay.
You want to, why don't you know, it's interesting to me because I've been working in the field for quite a while, some might say too long, and so I kind of get into the whole acronym soup, and you know, when I've heard about EEOC for a long time, involved with the ADA, but you know, gosh, a lot of people, when I said, oh, we're going to have a guest from EEOC, I said, well, what's that? So what is the EEOC?
EEOC is the key civil rights agency on the federal level that's responsible for enforcing the federal laws that do not allow employment discrimination. And so we have very important work in that individuals have that civil right to bring complaints to our agency, to have us investigated, and sometimes where necessary to actually litigate cases. So our mission is to promote equal employment opportunity throughout the U.S.
Maria, now that you've given an overview of the EEOC, what does the EEOC do about employment discrimination and harassment?
Well, employment discrimination, unfortunately, can have many ugly faces. And harassment is one of those issues that we frequently see when people bring complaints to our attention. So harassment means unwelcome conduct.
Yes.
Unwelcome conduct because of your protected category, your race, your sex, religion, disability, for example. And it either can unreasonably interfere with your ability to do your job, or it creates an overall intimidating, hostile environment. And in fact, harassment has become such a serious issue that it is one of our 6 emphasis areas under our National Strategic Enforcement Plan. And so unfortunately, we need to re-educate people, raise awareness again about harassment, so that employers know that they are not to permit this in the workplace, and so that workers know that they don't need to be subjected to harassment. They have a right to complain and to put an end to it.
Maybe we should back up a little bit too, and you know, again, just for those viewers that may not have had a lot of experience in this area, I mean, I think the term discrimination is fairly familiar, but could you kind of Could you give us some of the ways or what constitutes employment discrimination?
And that's a very good question, because often people confuse discrimination with what is unfair. And there are many things that are unfair.
Yeah.
But for the EEOC, discrimination means different treatment, usually negative different treatment, because of these protected categories I'd mentioned before. So no discrimination due to race, color, sex, religion, national origin, age, disability, pregnancy, LGBT status, and genetic information. And so what can happen is sometimes employers may treat workers differently in hire, fire, promotion, transfer, wages, harassment, not provide an accommodation due to religion or due to disability. They take negative actions in any aspect of employment, terms and conditions, benefits, and privileges of employment.
Maria, over the years, how far have we come along to eliminate discrimination?
You know, I've been asked this question a lot. I think it's because I let it slip that I've been with the EEOC for 24 years, so I've seen a lot. So that's kind of different ways to look at it. On the one hand, I've seen a lot of important things that have taken place. And our laws are always evolving because our workplace changed, our demographics, like our expanded coverage for LGBT individuals. Or there was an important Amendments Act to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which gave more broader protection to people with disabilities. On the other hand, though, there are always novel or different forms of discrimination, like the genetic information discrimination. Yes, you still have things that are ongoing, like race discrimination, for example. There's the discrimination due to harassment issues and the like, but then you see these novel forms of discrimination. The genetic information, for example, caregiving discrimination. There could be discrimination against people because they're victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking.
Yes.
Criminal records could be a factor that can cause employment discrimination. So there are many things there that unfortunately I think we're going to continue to have to educate people about this and to combat them.
I think one of the the challenges that people face, and I'd be curious to know, and for the viewers out there, we do prepare some questions and some ideas of things to talk about, but one of the things that we really enjoy about Hello It's Us is that we allow the conversation to flow, so that's what I'm going to do with you now.
Sounds good.
And talk a little bit about, you know, I think that one of the things that people don't, that creates discrimination or that keeps it going even, is that people really don't know what their rights are. They may think that, you know, a particular type of treatment is normal, or is that just the lack of individual education? Is that a contributing factor to discrimination?
I think that can be a factor, especially for workers and often for first-line supervisors. Sometimes employers, they're very conscious about costs and they may not provide that training on the front end, again, to the workers or the supervisors. Sometimes people are just become accustomed to a situation. I think that's the way it's always been, and they don't realize that it's discrimination.
I know I'm dealing personally with well, it's a health challenge related to cancer, and it has been just unbelievable, the level of support that I've gotten in terms of the time that I've needed for treatments and surgery, and working collaboratively with other colleagues to make sure that work gets done, and figuring out, you know, when I'm not able to do it. And it's a really terrific feeling when you don't have a sense of discrimination, when you feel like people understand it. And I think there are probably different levels of understanding, right? I mean, I've heard people talk about in terms of, well, I have to do this because it's the law, and then you get those situations such as the one that I'm in, that, you know, obviously employers are conscious of the law, but they're also conscious of wanting to maintain good working relationships and keep their employees around. And so, you know, I've had a good experience, and I'm sure there are, you know, other experiences that people have that aren't so good, and they have to really fight to keep their rights and to keep their jobs because of a health condition.
That's true, and a lot of times employers need to remember that making the workplace equal opportunity for all actually is good for their bottom line if we're going to talk dollars. So if you have a workplace that's free of discrimination, guess what? That's the employer that's going to attract and retain the best qualified employees. They're going to have loyalty from their employees. These employees are going to be more mindful about their work. They're not distracted by harassment or perceived discrimination. And they have less turnover. These employees are going to stay because they feel that they're valued by their employer, because they're putting a stop to discrimination, not allowing it to happen, and therefore these employees don't take their talents elsewhere.
Without mentioning the employer's name or company, have you had any trouble with getting accommodations for people with disabilities so they can carry out the job?
Actually, accommodations due to disability is part of our national strategic plan. So we have a lot of emerging issues, and one of the things we are concerned about is accommodations for people with disabilities.
Okay.
One of the issues that we've seen involved a very large, well-known employer who had a no-fault attendance policy. Not sure if you're familiar with how those work. The employers often will assess points against a person, regardless of the reason that you have for being absent from work. Well, sometimes people need an accommodation under the attendance policy. They may need to take more leave, for example, or maybe they need to have their start time adjusted and make up the time at the end of the day. And so this one employer would not provide accommodations under that no-fault attendance policy. It affected many workers, and in the end, unfortunately, it cost the employer lots of money.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's, maybe we should talk a little bit about disability, just in terms of how the EEOC defines disability. So when we're talking about disability-related accommodations, without going into every single list of disabilities that are out there, because that could take up the rest of our time, but can you give us a kind of an operational definition of disability?
Sure. For people to be protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's a three-pronged coverage for them. One would be that they have a physical or mental impairment, which substantially impacts the major life activities. Walking, sleeping, eating, breathing, bending, communicating, operations of individual organs, for example. All right. The second one would be the person has a record or a history of a disability. Maybe they had it in the past, they don't have it now. It could be something like cancer. It may be in remission or unfortunately may come back. And then the third category of protection is the perceived or regarded as. So the person has some type of medical condition, but in the mind of the employer, they think of that person as having a disability, even though it may not rise to that level. So again, a very broad view when we look at disability.
Wow, that is a broad view, because when you stop to think about, and I would imagine that third one is a little bit harder to prove. Are some of these, I mean, even like in the case of my blindness, I mean, it's pretty out there. You can't get around it. But
well, let me give you an example about the procedure regarded. I won't name the employer, even though we filed a lawsuit, which means we can't name them. But this involved a fast food restaurant, and a woman applied for a job as a cashier. And she had on her face what is called a port wine stain. So it's like a discoloration of her skin, covered about 3/4 of her face, like a dark purpley birthmark. She was denied hire. Now the employer went higher because they thought of her as being limited in her ability to communicate or interact with the customers. But you're intelligent men, as I'm sure our audience is. Does that skin discoloration rise to the level of disability? No, it doesn't. And does it impact her ability to bag hamburgers or make change or take an order at the cash register?
It doesn't.
No, it didn't. But the employer perceived or regarded her as having a disability.
How did that finally work out?
That was resolved in favor of the charging party, my recollection.
That's good. So hopefully she's working somewhere.
Hopefully so.
Yeah. Did you mentioned earlier something about the ADA Amendments Act, and so that there were some sweeping changes, and I know that we sort of touched on the expanded coverage. Could you talk a little bit, and maybe you already have, in terms of talking about the association, or I mean the being perceived or as having a disability? Are there other types of disabilities or groups that under the ADA Amendments Act that are now covered under employment discrimination laws?
Well, one is we recognize bodily functions, neurological,
Okay.
for example, reproductive, and the like. We also recognize that some conditions may have ebbs and flows. So people who have diabetes or epilepsy, for example, or cancer, all right? And when these flare up and it impacts the major life activities, that's a person who's covered. It's a person with a disability. And it used to be under the original ADA and some subsequent Supreme Court decisions that individuals really had to show a severe or significantly impacting a major life activity. Now we take a common sense approach. In other words, whatever that condition is, does it impact a major life activity as compared to most people in the general population? And the importance of the Amendments Act is that there's more coverage for people who have physical and mental impairments, meaning we don't have to get bogged down by a lot of analysis. Let's move on then to the other important issues. Is the person being discriminated against, not being hired, or not being provided an accommodation?
Could a major life activity, now like I mentioned earlier in the case of my cancer, I have had no issues when I've had to have appointments. I mean, I have the time off banked, but even if I didn't, I know that would be taken care of so that there would not be a threat to my employment. But let's just say that a person, whether it's cancer or another condition, had to go in periodically to get treatments. So could potentially that be considered a major life activity, and that it would impact the person's ability to go to work for a day or for whatever time the treatments are happening?
Well, I guess I would frame it more as an accommodation issue. So in other words, the person has this condition, a disability, cancer, it's active, they need to go in for treatment, and the employer may need to give them that time off, whether it's paid or unpaid. And when it comes to accommodations, employers need to provide the accommodation unless they can prove an undue hardship. And that gets to the crux of the situation. By an undue hardship, we're talking about that it may be cost prohibitive for that employer, or maybe there are some safety considerations and the like. But you have to look at that particular employer and their resources. So what a Fortune 500 company could provide may be different than what the small employer can provide. The important thing here is that the employer needs to think about providing an effective accommodation. Doesn't have to be the Cadillac accommodation.
Right.
It could be the Prius accommodation, as long as it's effective. And often when employers hear about undue hardship, a lot of them, clutch their hearts, and they may think, oh, this is going to cost a lot of money. And that may not be the case. The Job Accommodation Network had done this study in 2010, and they surveyed employers about the cost of accommodations. And they found that in 79% of those employers, the accommodations cost under $500. And of that, 31% cost zero.
Yes.
Zero. And only 1% cost $5,000 or more.
And sometimes if the employer listens to the future employee, it won't cost much at all, because that employee knows what he or she needs to do the job.
And you brought up a very important point, Keith, which is when there is a request for accommodation, no fancy government words needed, no waving a magic wand with special words. But once the person says, hey, I have this issue with the disability, I need assistance, what is the employer supposed to do? Talk about it.
Yes.
Have a conversation with the employee, not start throwing paper barriers at the person. By having that discussion, they can figure out what type of accommodation the employee needs. And you're right, the employee or the job applicant knows what they want. I have this great story about an employer not having that conversation. So they have an employee who comes in, and the person is in a wheelchair. And the employer has those old-fashioned, ugly water coolers, those big, tall, rectangular ones, right? And the employer's thinking, oh, this person's in a wheelchair. They're not going to be able to get a drink of water. So right away they're thinking, oh, we're going to have to rip out that old water cooler, open up the walls, get a new water cooler where you can get under it with the wheelchair. You got the drywall, you got all the piping, et cetera, et cetera. They forgot to have that conversation with the employee. So they have that conversation with the employee who's in a wheelchair. Well, everyone is different who's in a wheelchair.
Yes.
Someone may have significant limitations, let's say Stephen Hawking, the famous physicist, but it could be someone who could be wheelchair athletes, like in that movie Murderball, the basketball players, right? So this person in the wheelchair told the employer, I have a lot of upward body mobility. Just put a Dixie cup dispenser there. So here the employer was thinking about that 1% that costs $5,000 or more, and the employee said Dixie cup dispenser, probably what, $10 or less solution.
Yes.
That's why it's important to have the conversation.
You know, I can tell a positive story about, and it does happen to be the Center for Disabilities and Development where I work, but when I first came to work there, we actually sat down and talked about the job tasks and what kinds of things were going to be needed to get my work done. And at that time, scanners with voice recognition had just come out, so we actually made a road trip so I could actually interact with the scanner and see how effective it might be. Initially, it worked out pretty well, and then, you know, obviously as email has evolved and electronic access to information, that has changed a lot. But you know, it is so important, as you say, to have that conversation, and it certainly communicates to the employee that they're valued and that they want to get the maximum effort out of the employee.
Yes, it does. Having that conversation is crucial. Like Keith said, the employee knows what's best needed. But you know what? Sometimes even an employee may not realize all of the different, for example, assistive devices that are out there.
Yes.
And often organizations will come in and they will help the worker and the employer figure out a solution. Job Accommodation Network, for example, and I'm sure everyone is familiar with a nonprofit organization that focuses on people with disabilities, and they can come in and they can help do assessments and demonstrate equipment and the like. So there's always resources available.
Absolutely.
And today, with all the new devices coming out, there is really no excuse to prevent someone from working who really wants to work.
That's true, and it's important for employers to have that information, because sometimes they focus so much on what the person can't do
Yes.
instead of focusing on what
What
they are
they
able
can
to
do.
do. Correct.
Well, speaking of that's a nice segue into a discussion of some of the barriers that are faced by people. And I found this to be really educational as we were preparing for our time together today. You know, you think about some of the common ones, like, you know, physical, and of course we work in disability and live in the world of disability accommodation, so, you know, you think about access to information, you think about some of those environmental things that present barriers to employment. But I think it would be interesting for our audience to consider some of the other barriers to employment faced not just by people with disabilities, but just by people in general who may have been disenfranchised in one way or another. Could you talk about that a little
Well, I have an example about learning disabilities, if I could share that
Sure,
story
yeah.
with
Yes.
you.
Absolutely.
And I love this story. This involves a young man who applied for a full-time permanent position with a well-known automotive company. And he had a common disability, a learning disability.
Yeah.
Part of the requirement was you had to take a written test. But he has a learning disability, right? So he asked for accommodation. He needed more time to take the test because it was a timed test. And because he had trouble reading, including dyslexia, he wanted someone to read the test questions out loud. In other words, he wanted auditory reinforcement
Okay.
to what he was reading. Unfortunately, Keith, that conversation didn't happen. So the employer did not talk to him about his need for accommodation. He never took the test, with or without accommodation, therefore never ended up getting the job permanent. So when we go and look at this case, first of all, since it was a well-known automotive company, lots of money, there was no cost argument to not provide the accommodation. They very easily could have given him more time, and they could have had someone read the test questions out loud. Or in a Prius accommodation, have someone record the test questions in the tape recorder
Yes.
and him press a button. But the best part of the story is this written test and its importance, right? It was required, right? So we get a copy of this test. I have a college education. The attorney, EEOC attorney assigned to the case, a law degree. And we both look at this test and we think, this test is freaking hard, all right? So what kind of job was this young man applying for? Structural engineer? Quality control? Safety inspector? No. This would have been his job if he had been hired full-time permanent. The cars come down the assembly line. He snaps on door guards and windshield wipers. I ask you, How much reading, writing, arithmetic do you need to do that job?
Very little.
On top of that, the job was OTJ, on-the-job training. You didn't read a manual on how to do it. Someone else shows you how to do it.
Yes.
And here comes the best part of the story. He was already doing the job. He had been working there in the summers through a temporary staffing agency, already doing that job, but not required to take that written test. So that begs the whole question, how relevant is that test? If he can do the job through the temp agency, but as soon as he wants to become full-time permanent, the test is important. So we found a violation in that case.
And most of the time, we find that people with disabilities show up more for work than people without disabilities.
I have heard that also, that people with disabilities are more mindful about their jobs, they're excellent employees, they're extremely loyal, the employers don't have problems with the person with a disability once they're on board working for them.
How can we get, I think one of the things in that case, it's great that the gentleman actually spoke up and requested an accommodation, but I've often heard in situations where somebody has a learning disability that, it's invisible, and they don't want to have to, it can be stigmatizing for them to admit that they need assistance. What steps has EEOC taken, or what can we, even as advocates, do to educate employers to be more proactive and just say, on the application or when somebody can, is there any assistance? Sometimes they might not even know the word accommodation, but is there any assistance you might need with this application?
Well, employers are a little bit in a difficult position there because on an application form they cannot ask the person, do you need an accommodation? Because then they're requiring the person to divulge medical information about themselves. So they can't do that. But certainly if an employer sees, let's say, a work issue that's going on, they can have the conversation with the employee to find out what the issue is and maybe discuss what options there are. Now, if the person does need assistance, most of the time they do need to speak up.
Yes.
But if the employer is aware that there may be an issue because of a disability, then the employer themselves may have the responsibility to provide the accommodation, even though the person didn't ask for it. May I give you an example about that?
Yes.
Sure.
This involved a young man with learning disabilities again, and he came to work at a hotel. And his job was to fold linen and to fold towels, and then put them on a cart and drop them off in hotel rooms, as well as put them in these linen stations. But because he had this cognitive disability, he didn't know how to do it. And the employer had hired this young man through DVR, the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. And they started to write him up, that he didn't fold the towels right, he didn't get them into the linen station, and then finally they terminated him. Now the young man was not in a position to articulate any need for accommodation, but the employer was aware he had this condition, he wasn't doing his job correctly because of that condition. Therefore, in this case, we ruled that the employer should have known he needed an accommodation and have provided it. So we did find a violation.
So there is some onus on the employer in cases like that.
In cases like that, that's correct.
And I think it's up to Mike and I, probably you two, to encourage people with disabilities to speak up and say what they need.
That's correct.
It would be very helpful.
Right.
I know our time is running short, but we would like you to tell us what if someone does feel that they're being discriminated against and are interested in filing, or at least looking into the possibility of filing. What's the first step they would take?
I would say to reach out to the EEOC and to give us a phone call. You don't have to prove employment discrimination, but maybe something doesn't feel right. I say go with your gut feeling.
Okay.
Something's going on, you can't quite put your finger on it, you think maybe it may have to do with your race, your disability, your sex, or whatever. Give us a phone call and we'll talk about it. We'll discuss what the law is, discuss the situation. If the person wants to proceed, we will help them with that process, and then we would prepare a charge for that person. First step would be to contact us. People can call us toll-free. They can use the relay system. They can send us an email. And now we have updated our website, and people can begin the process to make a complaint online with our agency. It costs nothing, and you do not need an attorney to make a complaint.
Terrific.
Well, Mike and I would really thank you for coming and being so explicit in your information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm glad to be part of the program for today.
Thank you.
Good night.